So any database that we create without having ways in which we can actually do things to the database, the CRUD, as we said before, it's pretty much useless. So what we're going to do here is create the CRUD operations, right? So again, this is what we call create, read, update, and delete. Very simple. Well, how do we create then those operations? Well, we're just going to create them in terms of functions or methods. So the first one is going to be create. In this case, it's the same thing as adding. So I'm going to say add contact. That's right. So we're going to just add one contact at a time. So you can say public void add contact like that. And then inside here is where we can actually invoke the database and do all sort of things. But how do we then make sure that we can invoke the database and make sure that everything is ready for it to be invoked and do things we want to do? Well, first of all, we have to instantiate or create our SQL database class here, right? Or object. I'm going to call this DB. And we're going to go ahead and say this dot get writable database. So what's happening here is very simple. Well, the fact that we have our database, SQL database object floating around, that doesn't mean that it's ready for us to actually write to it. So it's always important to say this, that get writable. Remember, this means this class here, which, as you know, implements the SQLite open helper, which has all these methods and functions and classes that we need to get stuff done. Okay, so we need to create this instance and invoke the get writable database so that it knows, okay, this database is indeed ready to be used. So once we do that, we need to create then a structure that allows us to then create all of the things, for lack of a better word, all of these items, all of this data that we want to put inside. We could create a hash map because it would have key values and all that stuff, but there is another structure, database structure, called content value. So that is what we're going to be using, right? So that's what it's usually recommended to use whenever we're dealing with databases. So you just go say content values. Like this, okay, it's just a type, and I'm going to say value is equal to new content value, okay, like this. If you say values dot, there's a lot of different things here, and most of this stuff, it looks exactly like what we saw before, like a hash map or an array list, but it has more things to it that we can actually use, and it's known to be great for databases. There we go. So now we can put things into our value. So I'm going to say value dot put. Notice now here we can pass, of course, that key value dependency we talked about. So what is it that we're going to put right now? Well, first of all, we're going to put a key name. So I'm going to say key. Actually, it has to be util, that key name. That's the first thing we're going to do. And what are we going to put inside of that? Well, we're going to put something like Sandro, like that, a name, right? But because we want to make sure that this add contact is dynamic, because we're going to be calling it from somewhere else, right? We need to get the actual name from the user. But now, how do we then get the actual contact object? Because we don't have a contact object here, right? Well, why not passing here? We can say contact and say contact like that. Of course, we'll have to import because that's a class somewhere else. Import like that, and voila, now we have access to our contact object, which means now we can just say contact dot get name, just like that. Notice that we're not adding this ID here because this ID, as we said, it will just be added automatically. So whenever we're adding a new name or new contact, we just add the name and the phone number. You never add the ID because that is indeed the contract. That is indeed something the SQL system will do for us. Okay, very good. So we're going to do the same thing for values.put. Again, util that key phone number, because that's what we need to add. And how to do that? We say contact that get phone number, right? So now you can see when we instantiate this whole class here, database handler, it will go ahead and create a database handler for us, create a database, give it a name, a version, and it's going to go ahead and create an actual table as we set it to do it here. And then if it needs to drop, it will go ahead and upgrade and all that stuff. But when we say add contact and we pass an object contact, that's all it's going to do. It's going to go ahead and say, okay, we got a new contact, get the name, put inside of this key. So now really what's happening is when that happens, we're going to say James is his name. I'm going to put James here under name, phone number. This is the phone number that's going to be added. All right. And of course, again, I will repeat this. The ID will be added itself. So the first thing that is added is the ID, and continue to add more. ID is going to be 2 and it's going to be incrementing. Okay, there we go. So now that we have our content value, so now we have this big object that contains the name and the phone number, right? What do we do with it? Well, we need to insert into our table. Because at this point here, we haven't inserted anything. We just inserted the data inside of this content values, which is just a hash map, like I said, so of some sorts, that just we are putting it all together so that we can then take these values and then pass it to our database, which is a writable database at this point. Right? So here, I'm going to just go ahead and say we have to insert to row. So that's another way to say we're going to insert this information now. Okay, how do we do that? Say db, what we have created here, dot insert, look at that. And we can insert our util. Now, the insert method, you have to pass a few things before we actually pass content. As you can see, we have three things we can pass. The string table, the null column hack, which we don't really care about, and then finally the content values, which is the values. Now you notice the reason why we created the content values and added all the values for our contact before we do anything, right? Because it accepts content values types or objects. All right, there we go. So the first thing is going to be the table, because it needs to know, okay, what table we're going to insert this data to, because it needs to know what table we're going to be inserting this data into. Okay, because remember, a database can have multiple tables, so we can just assume that it will know which table to add to. Even though we only have one table here, we could have 100. So we need to always pass which table we're going to pass the data into. So what table we're going to do? We're going to say util dot table name. What else? For the string here, hack, I'm going to just pass null. We don't need that. And content values, well, pass the values, folks. There we go. That's it. There we go. We've inserted something under table. Now, it's always important to close the connection when it comes to doing database. What that means is, okay, once we insert something, that means the table is open, right? And you don't want to leave tables open at all time, because this is not a good. You're going to end up having a lot of memory leaks and very unwanted things happen. So it's always a good idea to say db once you've done doing whatever you want to do with the table. Say db dot close. Okay, so we are closing db connection at this point. There we go. Okay, very simple. So if we can add a contact, we can also get a contact. Let's see how we can do that. So I'm going to say here, get a contact, just one. Well, we have to think here. What is that we're getting? Well, getting a contact. What is a contact? It is an object. So if we're getting something, that means we have to have a method that returns something. So that means this method here has to be what? Well, it has to be a contact type, because that's what we're going to be returning. So what we do here, I'm going to say public contact, okay, like that. I'm going to say get contact. Now, to get a contact, if you look at this structure here, if we want to get James, well, we need to get an ID to get James. That's the idea. That's the use of having IDs, right? So we have to pass an ID when we want to get one contact. It's just an integer. So I'm going to say int ID. Okay, we're going to do the same thing we did before. So SQLite database like that, DB is equal to this, that get readables. Look at the difference now. Get readables, and we're not writing, we're just getting something from our database, our table. So we say get readables to read, right? And now I'm going to create another instance of a cursor object. So what is this cursor? Well, a cursor is just an object that allows us to iterate through and point to our database items or our tables rows. So a cursor, just like this cursor here is the computer, I can point to this one and then point to this one and then point to whatever else I want. So that is the idea of this cursor object in database. All right, so we're going to have to create one here so that it's easier for us to cursor through, to iterate through our database table and get stuff that we want. Now, the reason why you want to use these classes that are available to us is because it makes it much easier for us to do things. Can you find other ways in which you can actually get things from the database? Of course. But why fight the system if the system was made to help us? Okay, so I'm going to create a cursor. There we go. It says cursor is an interface in the database package, Android. Very nice. Let's call this cursor, and then I'm going to say it's equal to database. So I'm going to go straight to database.query. So I can query our database and put inside of a cursor there. So to query a database, there's a lot of things you may need to add. But remember, the first thing we need to think about is, okay, what is it that we're querying? We have to query a table. Well, what is that name of the table? Well, the name is going to be util, that table name. I hope you can see the reason why we put all of those names for our table the version, everything inside of our util class. You see how easy this is? Because if we had to actually write the table name every time, we could make mistakes and run into a lot of troubles. All right, so there we go. We passed that one first, and then we can pass string of columns. So at this point here, what we're trying to say is that, okay, when we want to get stuff from our database, we can specify which columns we want to get stuff from, right? In this case, we can say we want to get name, we're going to get phone number, we're going to get ID. If we had other ones, other columns, we can also specify those. Let's come back here, put comma. That's the reason why you have all those options. See that string columns there as the second parameter there. So we can pass actually a new string array, remember? So we can pass all the types that we want to see. In this case here, I just want to see util.keyID. I just want to receive that when I get my contact. I also want to pass util.keyName, and I also want util.keyPhoneNumber. All right. In fact, let's put all of this in a new line so we can see all of that. So we still have a problem here because there's other things we have to pass. So I'm going to say comma, new line. So what is next that we're going to be passing here? Well, we need to pass the ID that we want to get the information from, right? We say get one contact. Well, we also need to pass the ID here. So I'm going to say util.keyID. Now, because I'm querying here, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to have to append like this, equal, and I'm going to add the question mark there to say, okay, I am actually wanting to receive an ID. And what is this ID I'm actually wanting to receive? Well, we have to put in a new line here, say comma, and then look, it says string selection arguments. Because again, when we are writing SQL language, we have to be very specific, right? So at this point here, we can pass a bunch of different IDs. That's why we need to pass yet another, I know, string array here, okay, which we can then say, I want to pass an ID. Now, I can't just say an ID as such because this ID is going to come in as an integer. But at this point here, this is an array of strings. So I need to say string.value of and pass the ID as such, okay, because this is supposed to receive strings. And at this point, if I just say ID, you saw this ID here is not a string, right? This ID is an integer. Very good. So that is the ID that we need to be passing. All right. Very good. So the next thing we need to pass here is a bunch of nulls. I'm going to say null, group by. We don't need to group anything by. I'm going to say null having. I'm going to also say null the order. Okay, so we can actually pass all sort of things so that the data that comes back in our cursor is in a certain order. Maybe we want to append other things to our query. We can do that with having, and group by. We can also do all sort of things. So there's a lot of things you can do with SQL. Remember, this that we're passing here inside of our DB query, it is indeed SQL. We're just putting everything together into variables so that we actually can create a SQL. So inside, it would look again like something we saw before, something like this as a SQL language. Okay, very good. So it's taking a little while, I understand, but bear with me here. So now we have our cursor. So our cursor will then have, in this case here, this whole row. So it goes ahead and points to the database in the table. Okay, there we go. This is the person I'm looking for, assuming that is the ID we're passing. So it gives it this whole row. If we have about 100 more items and 100 more fields, then it's going to get the whole row, which is exactly what we want. Now that we have our row, we can then make sure that row is not null, because our cursor here could be null, could end up with nothing. So I'm going to say if cursor is not null, right? Then I'm just going to go ahead and say cursor.move to first. Okay, so it goes ahead and checks to make sure this cursor here has something. If that has something, meaning it's not null, we're going to just move our cursor to the actual place we want it to be. Point, for instance, to this row here, which is going to be reading everything. Okay, so now that we have our cursor, we're getting there, it's time for us to actually do some work. So in this case here, I'm going to create a contact object. Say contact object is equal to new contact like that. Okay, and I can use the constructor that has parameters there, or I can just come down here and start creating our contact. I'm going to say contact, in this case, dot set ID. Well, how do we get the ID? Well, it's going to be our cursor dot get string int column index 0. Okay, what's happening here? Let's go ahead and fix this first. We can have to wrap integer there. Very good. What's really happening here? Well, the cursor, we can invoke the get string, which is going to go and say, okay, I want to go and get the first column index 0. So at this point here, it's going to go and point, and I'm going to go and say, I'm going to go ahead and get the ID. So how does it know how to get ID? Well, it doesn't really know, but it knows where to find it. So we say cursor.getString, so get string, and we pass the column index 0. So everything inside of a cursor is going to be inside of an array or of a list better, and the index starts at 0. So that means you're going to go ahead and get this first index here, which is the ID, which is exactly what we want. And we're going to pass that to what? To our contact ID. We have to parse it and make it in an integer because when it comes out, it is actually a string. And we said the set ID has to be an integer. That's all that's happening here, folks. That's the beauty of using cursor. Okay, so we can keep doing this. I can say again contact dot set, let's see, set name. How do you think we're going to do? Again, cursor dot get string, or I can say get column name. So there's different ways in which we can actually get whatever we want. So I can say get string and pass again the second, which is going to be 1 in this case. So again, we go back and get the second one, which is the first name. So 0, this is 1, and this is third, or second, I should say, but the third item. Ah, very good. So I can keep going. So I'm constructing my object now. Set phone number. So cursor dot get string again, because that's what we're doing. We pass the column index. It's going to be 2 at this point. That's it. All right. So we have constructed our contact, which we were able to get through our cursor, because the cursor went ahead and got our row of information. It'll make sure that the cursor is not null, and we start then iterating through. And once that is all done, we create our contact and we start constructing our object. So now we have our contact object, which should have the ID, the name, and the phone number. All we have to do now is return contact. Like that. And that's it. All right, so I know it took a little while here, but I just wanted to go in detail so you will understand what's going on. So whenever we call get contact, we pass 1. It's going to go in and do all the thing that it needs to do, and it's going to construct our contact, which means it's going to go ahead and get the ID, get the name, and get the phone number for that particular ID. If ID pass was 2, and assuming that was Paul, it's going to go get ID 2, Paul, and that phone number. All right. Okay. If this made no sense at all, no worries. I want you to rewatch this video. And if you have questions, do ask, okay? I understand that this can be a little bit confusing at this point here, but do bear with me, folks, because we are going to continue writing a lot of code. In fact, this whole section is just going to be about writing code. So if you're really interested in getting this done, understanding, just keep writing this code with me. I'm telling you, it's going to work, okay? Very good. I'll see you next.